Most of us are involved in agriculture around here, and we get our news from the media, TV in Omaha, radio. The Corps engineers puts a report out through the media or through the radio that these levees are fixed. Okay, we find out today that those maybe are not quite fixed. They haven't been certified yet, but kind of the way Paul talks, they're done but haven't been certified. Well, every single farmer here is dealing with the situation. Do I pay 2.5 times my federal crop premium, or am I able to go back to where I was this past year? And it's confusing when we hear one thing, the levee's done. I understand where it's not fixed. That's not in the picture. Where they're saying it's done, then we come back and we're kind of hearing conflicting reports. That's, I guess, my question.
I understand that. We saw the same reports as well. And what we need some written confirmation from the Corps of Engineers, that district, Omaha district, that says the level of protection has been restored. Whether it's a temporary repair or not, what is the level of protection those breaches are providing? And that's what we've been going back and forth with Omaha about, the language, the information we need from them. The levee's been repaired to full, the breach has been closed and is at full height. And we're saying, okay, that means the level of protection has been restored to that level. And so we talked to them last Friday, and we said the Corps told us they're doing a lot of work over this weekend too, so repairs are ongoing, 24 hours a day, as you probably know. And so we're going to get more information from them when we get out of this meeting, or basically tomorrow, the next day.
Of the river from the institution or the completion of the levee system back in 1951. We had a flood in 1952. We had a flood in 1993. Had a flood in 2011, and now in 2019. And obviously, the silt on the inside of the levees has increased markedly. So we don't have near the ponding capabilities on the inside of the levee that we had when the levee was first put together. And my first question is, how much has the bottom of the river silted in?
Yeah, it's my 5-gallon bucket. Honestly, the river continues to, so when the structures are put in, it's got this imaginary plane so that it falls so many feet per mile. And that's been relatively stable over time, all right? That continues to be stable. It's adjusted every once in a while. It's called construction reference plane. I'm not gonna draw a picture because most of you would look at me like, what are you talking about? So it's there. But you are absolutely correct in the overbank that siltation has occurred, and it is magnified. And it's magnified because the levee systems are there, right? So the silt doesn't spread out over the floodplain like it used to when the channel kind of migrated. But the bottom itself, so you go to certain points. So like at Rulo, somebody told me, well, when it says it's a 14-foot river, that's not 14 feet anymore. And that's not true. What you're talking about is that you're seeing higher stages for less flow. And that goes back to the conveyance issue that we described earlier. It's like, why are we seeing higher stages for less flow? And things like overbank, sedimentation, right, accretion, roughness in the overbank, which can be trees or other obstacles. All of that stuff contributes to why you see those higher stages. And so the studies that Drew described, in the short term and in the long term, we hope to address some of those issues to get to the why, right? And the other thing to talk about is correlation. Just you observe something and you think, well, that's a cause. It doesn't usually work out that way, as that correlation doesn't always equal causation. And so we have to be very careful not to jump to conclusions about what the causation is. But it's absolutely true that we see higher stages for less flow in certain circumstances, okay?
Well, in this general area down here southwest of Rockport, what we call the river bend, got a few other names too. But we're having an increasingly hard time because there's a critical, after the river raises 6 feet over what we consider normal river, we don't have any internal drainage anymore.
Right.
That didn't used to be a problem.
Right.
So that means, to me, unless you tell me otherwise, that the river, the bottom of the river is raising.
And the converse can happen too, is that the ditches are deeper, which causes water to flow back against the flat gates sooner. You know, so that there's lots of issues that contribute to that. And the other thing is that we are seeing generally higher stages with more discharge in the last 10 or 15 years. In particular, the runoff levels have been exceedingly high. And so that also contributes to it. The tough part, like when you talk about a 1993 and a 2019, 1993 came to us in about a 57-day period. This year, we got the same 1993 flood event, but it went from March 13th until December 16th. So that period also contributed. It's the same amount of water, but in 93 we got it in 57 days versus 279 days this year.
There's been so many good projects, like say Highway 2 and on north, and all that's, you know, greatly appreciated. But how does that affect on down the river, say us here at Brownville or in that area? Has that been looked at? And I know, you know, there's nothing solid in the book that, hey, if this happens, this is going to happen. But just wondering, you know, what's that look like for us more out here?
Those guys in Omaha again.
So you know what I tell people is every time I touch a levee, repair one after a flood event, I change the outcome of the next event. I hope I made a positive impact on the next event, but I can't guarantee it. So in places where they are trying to open it up a little bit, give the river a little bit, you know, more space to flow, and then where infrastructure is following behind those levee repairs to maybe open up bridge openings and things like that, that's a good thing. But what we do know is that when you do it in just a piecemeal approach, is you only have a localized impact. And so what you're really looking for is a systemic impact. You want it to have an impact all up and down the river, and that's why there's concern up here with setting back 536 and the impact it would have on the non-federal levee that's just across the creek. So we're trying to figure out what those impacts would be and how, and if there are impacts, how we would mitigate it. But you know, it's like for me, I don't do wholesale levee setbacks where I do miles of it. I address it as when we have damages where I'm looking for a least cost alternative, I'll set that levee back, and we know we do have positive impacts on it. But there's never a guarantee, and it's not just us. So when the railroad comes in here, they start armoring their tracks. Right, every time we replace a culvert under a highway, we change the shape of the culvert, we move it from a box to a pipe, things like that. We change the outcome of the next event. And so we have to be very cognizant of that we can have a positive impact, but a lot of times, unfortunately, we end up having a negative impact.
I've been involved directly with Debra's estimate of cleanup for the levee. We've been involved with NRCS in getting our ditches cleaned out after the flood so that we will have workable drainage. We also have all three of our pumps. We have a neighboring district that we share in some pumps. We have 3 pumps. They have 2. We share one of the 2. And I've been in the process of just quickly going through, and we also have our drainage district has 1 levee breach. And this is kind of political part of it too, but I quickly run these figures through, and we have been a solvent district from when we began. We have saved for emergency situations, and I believe we have enough together that we can pay our 25% of our levee bridge. We've got an estimate on that. But the point I'm making is when you get around, and I'm very appreciative of the help that we get, only having to pay 25%. But as a drainage district, we bring in $14,000 a year. We have just done the estimate on between the two districts on our silt to be removed. That could be $500,000. Okay, if you're starting to get the figures, as a drainage district, we're running way, way short, which means that we are faced with some tough situations. You know, as landowners that are here today, boy, the one thing I really don't want to come to them and say, well, we're going to double, triple, or quadruple your drainage tax because we've got to get our drainage back in order. And this one's a tough one. We haven't had that before, but I just wanted to make that aware that on the state level, and we're not going to be the only one in this, it's going to be very, very common. But the dollars, you know, the dollars just aren't there. And it bothers me as a drainage district member and also on the board. These kind of things, this flood is going to make this much difference to everybody here if they pay drainage taxes. So that's all I have to say.
The governor supported and the General Assembly appropriated $6 million, but when you look at the scope of the damages that we saw, $6 million, I mean, it's good, and I think it was good that they recognized that there was a need there, but the way that's been structured is that the state is going to cover 75% of the 20% match on the non-federal PL 8499 levies. And even then, there's going to have to be an additional amount that goes in the General Assembly's funding this year to be able to take that and be able to cover all of that cost. And so I appreciate the comment. It's certainly something that we'll take back as we're talking with members of the General Assembly. There's just so much more need than there is funding available, at least on the statewide level, but certainly appreciate what you're describing, that's the case and there's a lot more need out there.
Thank you.
I'd like to ask Corey a question. Are you seeing requests on ECP and stuff that are over, there is a limit, probably people should, I'm sure, are aware of it, but.
Yeah, there is a limit, and I didn't discuss it, but the limit is $500,000 per payment entity or individual, and we will have some that exceed that.
So that's a challenge. Obviously, Senator Blunt and Sam have been very helpful, and we keep going back and back and back to them for more funding because where they are in Congress. I mean, the whole delegation is helpful, but Sam and Senator Blunt are both appropriators, and that matters.
I'm Mike Knight. I'm a resident of St. Joe. Got some ground down here on the bottoms, the stuff that the city's trying to market, you know. Anyway, my question is, first of all, the statement. I remember for years, been around the city all my life, the river ran at 10 to 14 feet all summer long. And now, the last 2 years, we had a 20-foot river. There's no capacity left in the river. And I know it's very, very difficult to judge, you know, the amount of water to let loose and all this. But you had a hard figure of 141%. And I know I'm going by St. Joe gauges, but what does 100% river look like now? Because it isn't what it was when I was 10 years ago.
Go ahead. Go ahead. No, give that one to Joe. All right. So 5-gallon bucket. So it will change over time, right? It's not a static.
Right.
It's not a static environment. The more data we have, the more the average moves, right? So we got a little over 100 years of data. We move to 1,000 years. We probably have a better gauge on what normal looks like over a long period of time. You know, real problem here has been is that our amount of water is increasing, right? So we're releasing more water, and we only have so much capacity to do that. So it stays higher as we try to meter it out, so we're not trying to cause harm. This winter, you know, they're trying to get ahead of it, so they've been releasing 31,000 cubic feet per second from
I've
Gavin's,
seen
which
that.
is
We're
more than
running
double.
What used to be a summer river in the winter. Which
Correct, correct.
Tickles me.
And
But
so,
I don't know what 100.
or I said 30, 31, we've been at 38. We're getting ready to go to 41,000, and we're gonna do that at least 2 weeks ahead of when we would normally consider releasing that amount of water for summer. So we're trying to make space, and it's because over the last year in particular, there was more runoff per month than what we documented for that month as an average. And those averages were like 2 times average, 3 times average. The only month where we didn't exceed an average runoff month was October. But that 1 month doesn't help us because we still had all that water in the main stem system that we have to get rid of. It is a challenge, right? So everybody wants more capacity in the reservoir system. And I'm going to tell you, at the MLDDA meeting, it's the first time I've ever heard John Remus say flood control and navigation at the same time as priority, right? He doesn't say that much, very often, does he? So, you know, we understand that for flood control, you've got to have capacity. You have to have storage in the system. Everything else takes water, and the big water user is navigation. So we are, you know, somewhat encumbered by what comes into the system. It is a throughput system. What comes in's got to go out, and it's constant.
The only other thing I would say is that in addition to kind of looking at what's the plan in terms of our infrastructure that we want to implement, another thing that we're involved with the Corps and the other 3 states on is updating the flow frequency of what we're seeing out on the river. We're seeing a lot more inflow and runoff into the system, corresponding increases in what the Corps is releasing out of the system. So trying to take some of those things into account and updating what is the new normal that we should expect to see is something that the states are involved in as well.
How does one group get to raise their levies and we cannot?
I'm not going to answer that.
Hey, Drew's representing FEMA.
All right, so, you know, there's the whole thing about raising levies, right? What really governs it is it's locally, right? It's through the floodplain management program at each county level. Any county that has participates in the flood insurance program has to enact certain regulations and ordinances to participate in that, and it's regulated locally, right? It's usually everything's measured against the base flood elevation, so which is the 1% or 1% annual chance of exceedance, right? The 100-year flood event, and usually there's a increment that you can not have above that elevation. But there's like in Missouri, there is no organization that oversees levees. The state has lots of rules about levee districts and drainage districts, but they don't have rules particularly that pertain to levee systems. And so it comes back to the Corps of Engineers. And so my rules say that your levee can participate in my program as long as you abide by all laws at all levels, right? And so, I mean, there's nothing in my regs that governs the height of it too. Now, when we build a federal levee, what we're doing is we're trying to get the best bang for the buck versus benefits, right? So the height is set to optimize the benefits and the cost. With the non-feds though, you ask to come into our program, and so we generally will take what you have as long as there's nothing obvious out there that says that your levee is causing a detriment to others. But the short answer is that it's really governed at the local level. And so if your county floodplain administrator says it's okay, then that's generally acceptable.
Even though when you can endanger your neighbors.
That is true, and that's the downside, is that I tell people, and I told them in Atchison County this morning, I said, every time I touch a levee, every time I repair a levee, I change the outcome of the next flood event. And I hope that it's a positive outcome, but sometimes there are negative consequences. We don't raise levees, but do I raise specific sections? Yes, I do, right? So if I do a realignment, I increase the height at the downstream end of that realignment, where I tie back into that existing levee section, and then I taper the elevation back in. And the reason I do that is that it has there's a distinct possibility in the next flood event, when it performs to the top, that's where it's going to overtop. It creates some kind of hydraulic lift that we don't fully understand. So we're trying to push that water a little bit further downstream.
If you want to hear this argument really get heated, travel along the Mississippi above St. Louis.
Yeah.
And believe me, we don't have issues compared to what we have on that side of the state. Is that fair enough, Drew?
That is fair enough, yes.
So we've seen an uptick in mental health issues in the flooding areas, and it sounds like it's going to happen for more times. I was at an event up in Rockport, and there was a fellow that had a Century Farm, and they'd lost everything. And so I guess my question is, as the state and federal agencies, what are you guys doing to address that, to be more aware of that, to know what resources are available? And then what do you do with those people when they come in? A farmer's lost everything. He's showing signs and symptoms of depression. What do you do with that? I know that's a tough one, but it's real.
So let me take a stab at that. Farm Bureau has started to think about this quite a bit. Started to think about resources available. And so, we will, I think, in the very near future, start thinking about doing some training of local people so they get an idea what to look for. I'm going to forget the statistics, but well over, probably close to 2/3 of the rural counties in the state don't have any access to mental health professionals of any kind. I'm sure I got somebody here that could give me a better number, but it's shockingly high. So it's something we're thinking about, obviously, in the national level. American Farm Bureau and National Farmers Union have kind of joined up on this issue. We've also just recently started a project that Bayer had, Bayer Monsanto had to deal with this issue. So it's out there. We're aware of it. It's not something that we would have probably been concentrating on 10 years ago, so it's going to take us a while to get up to speed.
Can I say something?
Sure.
Bernice and I are with an organization. We're hired through the State Department of Mental Health. It's an organization called Show Me Hope. It's in the state of Missouri. You have different crisis counselors that are working up here in Northwest Missouri. You have them down in Joplin with the tornadoes. You have them scattered all over the state of Missouri. So what we do as crisis counselors is we go to your communities, we go to your farmers, whoever we can find, and we ask them if they've been affected by the flood. So not only are we hooking them up with resources, if they're needing resources to fix a house, get a refrigerator, maybe they don't have food, we also can refer them to counseling. And that's the majority of our job.
And once we meet somebody, that is something we address every time they finally open the door to us. It's taken us some time to get the community to feel comfortable with us coming. We did not start down in Northwest Missouri until October. And of course, the flood did not happen in October. But now, within the last, I'd say, month, we're seeing the doors open and people coming to terms and asking for help.
And just us being there and listening to them sometimes, talk about the devastation of it and the toll it took, it's just kind of a relief to have somebody to talk to about it also. But if there is further assistance they are needing, we will refer them on to agencies that assist in that area.
That was a great conversation, and I want to point out somebody up here. This is Kenny Wade. So after this meeting, if you all and you, sir, would give your name and number to Kenny Wade, I think that'd be awesome, right? We've been doing this for years. We recognize how much how stressful this is on landowners and the toll it can take on them, that I've never really thought about being able to point them in a direction for assistance, right? We have internally, we have our own teams that focus on our personnel when we go through events like this or something traumatic, they step in and assess whether we have some kind of needs, but I've never actually thought about sharing information with others, and we have lots of contact locally after an event. So please provide your name and number to Kenny over there, okay? Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, in Homeland Security, we say, if you see something, say something. And a lot of times, the first person to recognize that a person's having a problem is a best friend. You know, and encouraging that friend to seek help at the baseline, you know, when it's first recognizable, can go a long way towards keeping that person from spiraling down to a really bad place. So, you know, I think one of the messages should be, if you see something, say something, and be a friend. Just be a friend.
You also kind of have that, and it's not a bad thing, it's just kind of that mentality of I'm tough. I'm from the Midwest.
I don't want to ask for help.
Right, I don't want to ask for help.
And it sometimes takes about our third visit before they're centered on the necessities. And then they'll start talking about the mental health. But it takes a while for somebody to say, I'm not doing okay.
And I think a history lesson is too. We've always had floods in Missouri, April and June. In 1942, we had a big flood, and it only aggravated 3 people: Franklin Roosevelt, Senator Truman, and General Dwight Eisenhower in Europe, because they were building airplanes in Kansas City, and it stopped production. So Senator Truman had a study done in 43 and 44, and in December of 44, the Congress passed a bill, the Missouri River Basin Flood Control Act. And there was $60 million put in place. And in the next 30 years, there was almost $1 billion spent on dams, and levees, and what have you. And it worked perfectly until 1993. The thing is paid for because all of these dams generate electricity. They were set up so that they paid for themselves in 40 years with the sale of the electricity. Now then, things got changed sometime. The original bill said they had to be 23% reserves in these upper basin dams to prevent flooding in the lower basin. And they just barely get down to 23% these days. If they would go down just a little more. Now then, in 2019, the Corps of Engineers had 20 million acre feet available for flood control. You know how much they used? 3/4, 16 million. And they told us it was one of the wettest seasons ever. I stated to John, who runs the finger on the button up at the lower dam, how come you didn't run 55,000 cubic feet in April and half of May instead of 70? We would have had high water down here, but you wouldn't have tore up $2 billion, whatever the big number is, of levees. They were in place. If you didn't overtop them, they were survived. Question, why don't they run it right?
All right, Mike?
Defer that to Northwestern Division of Water Management.
Hey, no, look, seriously though, they operated to the best of their ability and within their authorities given to them, you know, through the master control manual and things like that. So, but a lot of that water coming down in March came in below the reservoir, so it was uncontrolled or unregulated runoff. So at that point, there's not, I know you got a comment, you can jump in anytime.
But April and May, you run 70 when you could have run 55.
So the whole point of flood control is to capture flood water and then meter it out by trying to cause the least amount of impact downstream to get yourself ready to capture more flood water in the event that there's another massive runoff or rain event, right? I can't answer a ton of questions about how Northwestern Division operates the main stem reservoir, so I won't even try to. But I'll give you an example of where it did pay off. So with Truman Reservoir, they got a lot of rain early in the season too, right? So they were letting 40,000 CFS out after the March event. There was a crest of water going down the river past Herman, Missouri, from runoff created in the upper basin, and then some Gavin's releases as well. And then we started releasing 40 behind that to try to bring Truman back down to make more flood storage available. So I got several calls from concerned people out by Herman, Missouri that, why in the hell is the Corps of Engineers releasing water out of Truman Reservoir when we've got all this water coming down the system right now? I explained to them, you gotta get water out of the system to get ready to capture more floodwaters, right? And so if they hadn't have been releasing that 40,000 out of Truman in April, when May came along, they would have hit surcharge and had to release an unprecedented amount of water out of Truman Reservoir, causing devastation like we've never seen before. So that's the whole point of it. Now, if there's areas to improve on the way that we operate the main stem reservoirs, I think that's something the phase 3 studies that Drew and them are looking at, working with the states to do that. But I can't answer specific questions on why they turn the dial, they do, and when they do it.
Yeah, and Mike's correct. I mean, so part of the discussion of the governors on the lower Missouri River is how we can improve the management of the system as it relates to providing flood control. That's not going to be a short-term process. The last time we engaged in a discussion and a fight involving multiple rounds of litigation with the upper basin states, it took 15 years to accomplish. So the Dakotas and Montana have a very different perspective on lowering those reservoirs to provide more flood control. You know, we fought them, we've sued them, but it took 15 years, and I think many would argue that we ended up with a worse outcome than what we had under the 1979 manual. But I think there are some positive signs in that the recent discussions of the 4 lower basin governors have expanded to include South Dakota. The current senator, Mike Rounds from South Dakota, happened to have a house that was impacted by the 2011 flood. So he has a little bit different perspective on how the system's managed for flood control. The last meeting even included the state of North Dakota. So certainly that's something that Governor Parson and the other governors are looking. How do we change the operation of the management to provide us more protection? We also want to focus on our infrastructure, the things that we're going to have more direct ability to change in the near term without having to go through the master manual process. You mentioned the Flood Control Act of 1944. The reality is that the system that was envisioned in the Pig Sloan Plan was never implemented. They started from Gavin's Point and they started going down. That's why it was envisioned to have federal levees all the way from Gavin's Point down to the confluence with the Mississippi. But the fact that they started in the upper end of the system is why there are so many more federal levees in Nebraska and Iowa than what we have down here, with many more non-federal levees. As you got down here, they also didn't implement the alignment of the levees. So you got areas where the reality is the levees are too close together. It doesn't matter how high you make them, you're going to cause flooding because they're not, they don't allow for the conveyance of that water. It's like trying to put a fire hose in a garden hose. It's going to back up behind there and you're going to see higher stage above that. So all of these things, including the things about operations that you reference, are things that definitely the governors are talking about, and we as state agencies in all 4 states are talking to our counterparts about how do we look at ways to change the management of the system, how do we look at ways to change our infrastructure to try and avoid the kind of devastation that we saw this past year and in 2011 and 1993.
We've got a zillion tons of used sand in these sandbags. Can we field apply that sand?
I don't have a concern with that, Bill. I mean, we've been trying to work with FEMA and SEMA and all the other agencies to look at that and other issues related to debris disposal, to dealing with woody debris. From my perspective, it came out of the river, and it shouldn't be a concern. But I'm going to need to make sure that beyond DNR, we're asking that question of the other agencies that are involved. And I don't know if any of the USDA representatives have anything to say about that. But from the Department of Natural Resources perspective, we certainly don't have concerns or any regulatory prohibitions on that.
Dan Price, Western District Commissioner, Sheridan County. Last year, Roy Blunt come down and gave us a little talk across the street in our little hotel. He said that he was going to go back to Washington, D.C. and try to get the Corps of Engineers to take over the river like it should be, and try to get fish and wildlife and recreation out of the program. Does anybody know if that's coming along?
Obviously, we would not have made the progress we've had and had the funding we have without Senator Blunt's intervention. So I appreciate what he's done for us and continues to do. I mean, this is when we talk 4 states, we've got 8 senators. When we talk 6 states, even assuming they would agree with us, part of the time we got 12. It takes 60 to get anything done. This is a tough political fight. We have to emphasize, we have to concentrate on the places where we can make a difference. And I think Drew did a very good job talking about some of the things that we can do to increase the conveyance of the river, changing some of those chutes, some changes. We're working very hard in Edison County to make some changes in the levees that I think will solve some problems that we have. And that's what we have to do. And Sarah is dying to answer.
So Commissioner, thanks for bringing that up. I can actually tell you that we are working with the lower basin senators, and I'm proud to say that actually this week we got all 8 in agreement. And so we are going to be dropping some legislation, maybe even this week, to give the Corps some more flexibility in the levee rehab. So we're working, and we have worked ever since the senator was here in Brunswick this summer, and we're actually seeing some movement like right now. So that's pretty exciting. So I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to say that.
I'm a resident farmer here in Brunswick, and I realize it's hard to coordinate a lot of states to how the flow should be. Has there ever been talk of adding a flood control structure down lower, like maybe on the Grand River?
Part of the Pick Sloan plan back in the 1940s, I think they had 3 or 4 different reservoir locations identified on the Grand River. But like Drew was talking about with the Pick Sloan levee system plan, they had designed, they got started up in by Gavin's Point, worked their way down through Nebraska and Iowa and started into northwest Missouri. But by the time those were completed, it takes a long time to construct those, and it just lost political will, it lost local interest, and it lost funding. And so very similar situation on the Grand River with those reservoirs.
I'm involved with the levee district to where we're fortunate. We do have our core project underway as we speak, but we're not sure if we'll get up to that certifiable condition by April 1st, the first corn planting date. I guess my question would be, will there be any extension if you're a day or 2 late, or say we get certified by April the 10th, the first soybean planting date being April the 20th? Would we then qualify for our last year's premiums on crop insurance if we elected to plant soybeans?
And that's a very good question, because that obviously could be a case in a lot of these situations. Really the hard deadline is if you get it fixed before you plant the crop. That is the last deadline that there is. Some of these other deadlines are if we can massively or efficiently apply it across the board to everybody. Those are the earlier deadlines. The earliest planting date, which we're talking about April 1st, or April 20th for soybeans. When we get past those earliest planting dates, then it becomes what we're calling an individual written agreement. So each and every single entity would have to request that and certify they haven't planted the crop yet, if it gets to that point. But yes, it can go clear up until the day you plant. So as long as the levee is fixed prior to planting, we can go back and give that pre-flood status or pre-breach of the levee. If that makes sense. Yes?
All right, so hypothetical for you, Les. I mean, we mentioned April 1st as the deadline. So let's say on April the 10th, we became certified by the Corps that we were at pre-existing conditions and everything was good. As long as no one in that levee district had planted corn before April the 10th, and on April the 12th, everyone could go plant corn and be in the good graces at their last year's premium rates, even though you're after the 1st of April. Is that how that would work?
After the 1st of April, then it's an individual situation. So it'd be a case by case.
Levee district per levee district.
Individual producer.
Individual producer.
Individual producer. Yep. For the situations on April 1st and prior, then it's by the levee district. So we can apply those pre-flood rate or pre-breach flood rates if it gets fixed and certified prior to the earliest planting date. After that, it turns into an individual situation that you'd handle through a written agreement.
So let me ask the question a different way. So if he plants, if the levee's certified on April 10th and he plants April 11th, he has to get it. He has to write in and say he didn't plant until April 11th, which he self-certifies, right?
Correct.
So you tell your service agent you plant on April 11th and certify the 10th, and you're good to go with the same risk level that you had last year, although the premium may be slightly different, but same risk level.
Correct.
But if his neighbor plants on April 9th, he's at the high risk level.
Correct.
Nice, I like that. That's what I was trying to get at.
Yep.
If a district fixes their levee breach on their own, I was kind of confused by how that was stated today. It was my previous understanding that if the Corps did not fix that levee, that the district was not eligible for that 75% of the 20%. Is that correct or incorrect? Like, would the district have a right to that 75% of the 20% if they fix it on their own?
So I don't think so, because the whole structure is that the payments come from the state to the Corps of Engineers. Partially because when the Corps does it, they prepare the project information sheets. There's a whole lot of information to document what exactly that's going to. And the reality is that the $6 million that was appropriated, there's a lot more need than that out there, certainly with private levies, but also there's going to be a need for additional funding in this year's budget to be able to allow CEMA's budget to be able to cover the 75% of the 20% local match. So that was what we settled on to try and maximize the use of that $6 million that was available. So the whole construct of that is the funding flows directly from CEMA to the Corps of Engineers. But if you want to catch me after the meeting and give me the specific information, I'm happy to take that back and talk to CEMA about it.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily think that would disqualify you from any CEMA funds, maybe not for that specific repair at that breach location. More often than not, what happens in scenarios like that, so if it's a non-federal levee district that participates in our program, they go out and push dirt up to build some temporary protection, or even build it back up to full height. As long as that falls in line with the repair plans that we had designed, then typically we can credit that back as work in kind. So that takes it off the overall cost and just credits it towards the work in kind that the levee district can do.
What is the possibility of diverting some of this water
So we are looking into long-range, long-term plans, and actually I'll let Drew pick that one up. It's our phase 3 process. Are you okay with that?
I guess so, yeah. Certainly what the 4 states on the lower river are interested in doing is looking at different ways that the system can be operated or changes that we need to make in terms of whether it's the levees or out of the box thinking in terms of different ways that we can reduce the kind of damages that we've seen. I will say that as it relates to diversions, I'm not quite sure what you mean about diversions. If you're talking about efforts below Gavin's to try and divert that water into another watershed, I don't know that that's something that's come up. Typically, when we talk about diversions, it is large projects like the state of North Dakota has a proposed diversion project to divert water out of the Missouri River in North Dakota and divert it into the Red River at the north. We have opposed that in the past because it doesn't tend to become an issue during flood operations. So the Corps operates the system very differently during flooding than they do during drought. The diversions on the upper part of the basin tend to be more impactful to us during drought than any benefit they're going to provide in terms of flooding, because the whole way the Missouri River system is operated is based on storage amounts. There's 16.3 million acre feet of flood storage in the Corps of Engineers reservoirs. So if you're diverting water out of the reservoirs, that doesn't change the amount that's in the master manual. Certainly we are interested, and I know the governor's interested in talking about changes to the master manual. The reality is the last time we entered into that process, it took 15 years and multiple rounds of litigation to maybe end up in a worse situation than we were under the old 1979 manual. So in terms of looking at longer range, the plan, what the governors are wanting to do in addition to looking locally about what are the things that we could do differently is look at the whole system and try and create the kind of design plan that we want to shoot towards in the longer range. We're not going to be able to change the whole system of the magnitude of the Missouri River in a year or 2 or 3 or 4 or 10. But we need to look at the kind of system that we want to move towards, and as we're able to make those changes that are going to improve the situation and reduce the damages, that's what the states are trying to work together to do, whether it relates to operations or the infrastructure and management itself.
Then also think about the sediment that deposits itself at the mouth down at the Gulf. And that happens partially because of the structure modifications that have been made and the severe stream bank erosion we have all along the river. And that stream bank erosion threatens our levee system and also threatens our drainage systems, plugs up our drainage system. So until you get those kinds of things back under control, and we have spent millions, probably billions of dollars creating that. And long ago, some of the politicians said to me, if those environmental structures have caused damage, that environmental money supposed to pay for repairing that damage, and that is not happening.
Yeah, and I'm certainly aware of that issue, and I know Coalition to Protect Missouri River, MLDEA, Farm Bureau, and we and the Corps, Department of Agriculture, we've been having conversations. I know there have been site visits going out and looking to those kind of impacts and trying to determine What do we need to do with our members of Congress to try and ensure that the funding is available regardless of where it comes from to be able to fix some of those issues? And I'm seeing more of a willingness to look at and address those issues, but we'll see. The time will test as to whether or not we're going to get the resources necessary to address whether it's notches or chutes or whatever it is, and the impacts that those are having on people's property and levees.
Let me follow up on that. The one way you can figure out what you need to do is talk to the partners out here in the country. The Colonel said, we don't want to call you all stakeholders anymore. You're not stakeholders. You're partners with what we're doing on the river. Now, unless you listen to your partners, you don't have a partnership.
Yeah, and I think that, when I'm talking about the meetings that have been hosted out at Farm Bureau and the site visits, those have included partners. Those have included the landowners who are being impacted, and some of those have occurred up around the Jeff City area and downstream of there, but certainly I know the impacts down around here. I know, I've heard about this for a long time now, and I think Colonel Hannon and his staff are listening to us, are going out and looking at some of these areas, and I'm hopeful that we're going to be able to get some resources to be able to fix some of those issues.
But it takes action. Listening doesn't solve the problem.
I agree.
You have to do something.
I agree.
One other question. I might not have this terminology right, but the IRCs, now are they done? Are we going to continue building those things or whatever? A lot of that money could be diverted to a lot of the stream bank erosion like Wilmer's talking about. So can you fill me in on what's going on with those structures?
So there have been 2 IRCs that have been constructed, and those are interception rearing complexes. These are habitat projects. They're not the chute projects. They are a little bit different than that. I don't want to get into all of what they are, but the reality is that our partners and the delegation have expressed concern that the amount of funding for the recovery program has been dramatically reduced in recent years to, and I'm not sure,
7 to 9 million.
7 to 9 million at its height. You're looking at 70 to, I can't remember.
72 million.
72 million was the high point. So there's been a dramatic reduction in the amount of funding available through the recovery program. I don't foresee in conversations with the Corps that they're going to be, the case we've made is, given what we've seen and learned about the chute projects that were done before, there were original plans to construct 12, I think, of the IRCs. They've already constructed 2. The case we've made is monitor the 2 you have, make sure you're not impacting people's property, make sure that it's providing any benefit to the species that they're purportedly benefiting. So we've made the case that no additional projects should be constructed until they understand that they're not impacting flood control, they're not impacting private property, they're not impacting navigation. And in some of the discussions that we had with Mr. James, the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, and the Division Commander within the Corps, I don't envision that in the near term there are going to be any additional of those constructed until everybody is much more comfortable that they're not going to impact other things than we are at this point.
And, going through this whole process from start to finish, initially the Corps did a phenomenal job bringing Cliff Sanders back in to get on site. That went very well, the time frame in that. However, just going through the entire process, our project has currently just been awarded last week, where if we could have went out there and done some repairs, we'd have protection, we wouldn't have the crop insurance issues. and a lot of levee districts can stand that initially, but they can't stand it long-term. They need to be reimbursed for that. So I just think that is the single biggest thing here, is if there's some way to revamp the system where we can go out immediately and perform repairs, you know, and have that to where we get, it may not be perfect or it may not be to the exact level of protection before, but it's a lot better than leaving it wide open. I mean, we've got Stedman, Capitol View, a bunch of them up there right now at 21 feet on the Jeff City gauge. It's going to start running back in. And the projects right now on those two are just out of bid. So,
Mike, you want to respond?
No, Jose, I agree with you 100%, because right now there is nothing in our policy that allows us to, you know, cut a check to the levee district for any sort of work that they do. And so that does limit their abilities financially on what they can do immediately post-disaster. That's because we have no mechanism under our current policy to pay them back for that work. So that's a policy change that needs to be made. Again, it can't be done at the district or division level. That has to come down from higher ups. But I'm totally on board with you there. I'd really like to see that implemented if we ever get new policy that comes out.
What does it take to get that policy?
Usually Congress has to authorize it. Now, we can write it and propose it. They have to approve it.
Well, let's do that.
We've got a lot of policy changes sitting on a desk in the Pentagon somewhere. They've been up there for a long time. I don't know what the status of them is. I'm not sure the specific issue you're talking about is written in some of those changes. I know, like the Kansas City district, my boss Jeff Knieven, he'd been trying for years to eliminate the whole 80-20 cost share and just make it all federal dollars to go into paying for the levee rehabs. One of the issues is when we go with that 80-20 cost share, it costs a lot of money administratively on the course side to manage a very small amount of cash from the levee district. So in many cases, it doesn't make sense. So that's another thing policy-wise that we're looking at. But it's really going to have to come down from Washington. And right now, I feel like we've got a lot of momentum, both at the state level and in DC, to hopefully get some of those changes implemented. I think now more than ever.
And I agree with that. And Jose, I think, I know you've come to a number of our meetings. I think that is something at one of the upcoming meetings in terms of a recommendation that could come from the state in the working group's report. I think I agree with Mike that with somebody from Missouri, R.D. James is the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works. He was here on Saturday. We talked to him about a lot of these issues, and I think we're never going to find ourselves in a better position to try and pursue some of those things. So I think we need to make sure that we're considering those things as we come out with the state's recommendations, because we're going to use those as the basis for both sharing with the members of the congressional delegation, but also working within the administration to try and implement some of those changes.